Our Attorney General, Merrick Garland, the chief prosecutor of the land, has decided to not go after pro-abortion protesters who are outside of the homes of the Supreme Court justices. Now, by the Constitution, they have every right to do this. You have the right to freely speak. There is a law in place that prevents protesters from protesting outside of Supreme Court justices' homes because this would be an intimidation factor, and this could potentially politically sway the position of these justices if they feel threatened. So there's a few things here. If that law, now this is a reasonable law, but it does go against the Constitution. I'll explain. You have this law, and the executive branch is supposed to come in and protect the Supreme Court justices from these protesters so that there's no intimidation. However, this does not serve us, we the people, well, because we all know this is politics. And there are political systems in place, even in these branches. So you have the executive branch, and the executive branch can be heavily politicized. Right now, Merrick Garland, who's he's the Attorney General, part of the executive branch, he is not willing to prosecute people who are, by law, intimidating the Supreme Court justices. Now, in the Constitution, you have a right to protest. There's no ifs, ands, or buts, whether it's an elected official or not. I'm not condoning it. I'm just saying what's in the Constitution. Now, the Constitution has a flaw because the Constitution gave all the power, all the authority, all the force to the executive branch. The judicial branch and the legislative branch have no force. This is a flaw because, one, the executive branch can take all their force, all their power, and use it against the other branches, effectively removing checks and balances. And also, when there are situations like this where you have protesters and there's potential intimidation, and the executive branch is not willing to use that law that the legislative branch passed a while ago to protect these Supreme Court justices, well, the Supreme Court justices don't really have any defense. They don't have any protection. You do have the legislative branch, they have Capitol Police, but that's not really enough. So if the legislative branch and the judicial branch had some force, whatever that force is, the Founding Fathers did not put it in because they didn't foresee that the executive branch would have all these different federal agencies, and they would use these federal agencies as a political tool to go after people. Or rather, they didn't think that the current checks and balances system, part of the Constitution, they thought it would be enough to protect each branch, when in reality it doesn't, because people are willing to use force no matter the collateral. So if we implemented that, then the justices would be fine. But if we're using the current law of the land, okay, we're using the current law, so we're analyzing that law, Merrick Garland is not doing his duty. And if it were any other type of protest, if it were a protest by conservatives or libertarians, Merrick Garland would have came in and he would have stopped those protests immediately. He has told the marshals to step down. He's told the executive powers to step down. He's not pursuing it at all costs. And that's because there's a certain ideology that Merrick Garland is part of. He's a cog in a machine. So the ideology, the narrative is, okay, we want abortions. It's no longer safe, legal, and rare. It's more abortions at any time for whatever reason, and we don't want to discriminate against who has the ability to get an abortion. And that's a totally separate discussion that we can have, but just analyzing this situation, again, if it were any other group, it would have been shut down. But because Merrick Garland sees that he's part of it, the left has created a facade. When you have a facade, you have to uphold that facade. You may not uphold it well, but America has done a relatively better job than any other nation at upholding that facade. So this is done through propaganda, this is done through deception, through fraud, through using the different apparatus that you have available to you, like the media, to spread information that puts your narrative first and prioritizes your ideology, even at the cost of truth. And so when you're able to convince young minds, because most of these people who are protesting, they're young individuals. They don't have jobs. They don't have responsibilities. They don't have families. Or if they do, they're not really taking care of their responsibilities properly. So they're out there protesting. They've been emotionally manipulated to a certain ideology. And why is it easy to emotionally manipulate them? Well, one, because they're ignorant, they're uneducated, they're not critically thinking, they're not connecting the dots properly. But also, it's easier to offer people a shortcut that is self-interested. Okay, so if you tell someone, let me just give you free money, you're going to say, because it's a shortcut, there's no effort involved for you to do anything, I would love to have free money, and you're going to vote for that person. I'm giving a very simplistic example here. So if you offer people a shortcut solution, a shortcut answer, most of the time, if it's part of their interest, they're going to take it. People think very short term, they don't think long term, they also don't critically think. They're not sitting there analyzing the different possibilities of what's better for the nation, better for private citizens long term. They're not in that frame of mind. When you tie that in with the school system, which is heavily indoctrinating kids from a very young age, you end up with people who are so radical in terms of ideology that you can't really have a coherent conversation with them. And so Merrick Garland is betting on that facade and using them as pawns. Now, what's really ironic is these people who are being used as pawns don't see that they're trying to fight for something so that they have more rights, yet the people who they're placing in power actually are degrading the rights. Merrick Garland and his crew, the people behind Merrick Garland, he's just the attorney general, but he was put there by other folks, really appointed by the president, but the president right now is not doing a lot of cognition. There are people behind him, part of the administrative state, who are placing people as part of the cabinet and part of the team. So these people, some of them are intelligent, but they're malicious. They have an improper ideology. And so they will use collateral, they will use whatever means necessary, just like in any other nation. People are deceptive, people are cruel, people don't care about collateral, they really don't care about individual rights. They just really care about status, power, wealth. In America, it's no different. You have people, now not everyone is like this, but a good majority are willing to pursue anything for power. And so they will use pawns, and if you're a young individual, they're trying to reach you. They're trying to reach everyone, but they're trying to reach young individuals first because they're young and impressionable. That's why over time they've reduced the voting age, because it's easier to manipulate people and then have them vote for you, and that secures your power. And then over time you chip away at their rights. So even if they did change their mind and they wanted you out of there, well, you already have so much power that it's effectively impossible to kick you out. And you also have just way too much force, so that there's no way they could deter you or use some type of force against you, because you just have too much force. And especially when they go after disarming the population, especially when they go after censoring you, you can't say anything, you can't do anything. So even if these young people magically wanted you out of there in an elected or unelected position, because you're doing harm on society long term, you won't budge. You don't have to budge. You have no reason to budge because you're not held accountable, and you have way more power even when you are held accountable. So this facade is really against, this ideology is really against the people who are proposing for that ideology. And people don't understand how there's a two-tiered justice system. It's a little bit more complex than that, but just to simplify the argument, you have protesters, not just in this incident, but in many incidents, who are causing havoc. They're causing billions of dollars in these liberal cities. They're damaging small businesses. Okay, so these are not like Walmarts or Targets, although they do damage those as well. There are small businesses who are just run by a guy, a girl, maybe they're a couple, husband and wife couple. They spent their entire life building a business, a laundromat, a restaurant. They're running off very thin margins, and people come in, they vandalize or they destroy these communities, destroy these areas, and they're not put to a stop by the federal government or by state government or by local politics, because there's a certain agenda that's being put in place. And they do it all for the narrative. That's the really amazing thing, is when you have local mayors, governors, presidents, or people behind the presidential, people in the presidential cabinet, they just care about the ideology. They just care about the narrative. What does it look like on TV? What does the public relations look like? How is it spreading on social media? As long as their narrative is fitting what they need, and they're getting that out of the people, they don't really care about the chaos, because they're protected in their own little neighborhoods, in their own little houses. They have their armed security, they got Secret Service, they got the Capitol Police. This is, I don't want to say it's treason, because in this incident, I've already stated how it is technically constitutional, but the flaw is that the Constitution did not advocate for force with the Supreme Court or for the legislative branch. So I'm more so using the technicality of the law right now that's on the books that should be enforced and has been enforced before, where this current administration is not enforcing the same law. They're deciding what they want to enforce. Now, at a certain level, you have discernment, but at a certain level, there's a threshold of when it becomes light discernment versus political prosecution. When are you going after people? Whether there's a law there or not, constitutional or not, let's put that aside, just the law in the book. When is it political prosecution? When is it light discernment? Because if you're prosecuting some people because you don't like their ideology, and you're not prosecuting another group of people, and let's say both are causing chaos, you're in the wrong for one of those situations, or both of those situations, depending on how you look at it. And so I say this every now and then, but it all comes down to accountability. If we're not holding our people accountable, they're going to run amok. They're going to do whatever they want. They will get away with destroying collateral, destroying communities, destroying our rule of law, allowing people to be intimidated, which is now going to sway how the courts rule, left or right. And so we're going to see now they're using force. generally you have to have culture, and culture determines public policy down the road, because when the average person, or when the majority of the average people agree with a certain ideology, that's when it becomes culturally relevant. So you can have a law on the book, but if no one is willing to obey that law, if 90%, let's throw out a number here, if 60% of the population is not willing to obey a law, let's say like walking your donkey backwards while eating ice cream, which may be a law in Kansas or something, most people are not going to obey it, and therefore there's not enough power with the executive branch, especially in local and state politics, to enforce that law. So it all starts culturally. Then it expands to public policy, okay? If now they're using force, they're trying to shortcut the system. They're trying to say, well, we're doing the cultural degradation, the cultural manipulation, but in some instances we need to come in with our force and forget about the cultural issues. We need to just come in and, with our minority of power, use our force. This should be a wake-up call to people. If they're not enforcing the law equally between people, we don't really have equality between all private citizens in America. And if it's not personally affecting you, it should be something on your mind, because if they're doing this, selective prosecution, it can come after you someday. You may think, I have nothing to hide, I'm not doing anything bad, but that's the point. If you're a threat to them in any way, or you've talked to someone who's a threat to them in any way, or you're connected to someone in any kind of way that's a threat, you will be a target. If we look at North Korea, we know that they go after like the next 6 generations of people. If someone commits a crime, they go after the next six generations of people. You're put into labor camps. They don't tell you the charge. They don't tell you why. You're just thrown into the labor camp. And obviously we don't want to have that kind of justice in America, because someone, an individual is responsible for his or her actions, not everyone else. If you're complicit in it, okay, there's a hierarchy of charges there. But we're not going to take one person and then the rest of your family for the next 6 generations is thrown in a labor camp. That's not how we do things in America. But we're getting to that point because if you have a regime that, all regimes love power, but let's say in America you have a regime who loves power, they're trying to protect their status quo, their establishment at all costs. And if there's any kind of threat, they want to place a barrier on that threat. They will come up with crazy ideas. We've seen history. We know what people have done. We know what dictators and different organizations and regimes have done to maintain power, to hold on to that security of power without interference. And so if you're interfering in any kind of way, you say something out of line, you say the wrong opinion, you say something that's a joke, but they don't like it. Of course, this is more radical, what I'm saying right now. But if you go down the line, 50 to 100 years from now, maybe even sooner than that, anything that is deemed as radical now can be seen as, that's a potential possibility 25 years from now. And we don't want to end up in a society where we can't even say what we think. We can't say how we feel. We can't protest effectively. We don't have any rights. We're not given a fair trial. That's not the place we want to live in. And that's definitely not the place we want our kids to live in.